Hey, you guys have a good time at Jamboree today? Yeah. It sounds like you had an awesome time at Jamboree, where you control the action. Hey, you've been in one of those situations where you can't control the action. Have you been in those situations where no matter what you do, you're crushed? Can you think of a situation you've been in where no matter which way you turn, you know it ain't going to work? Now, we're on a camp here together and you get to share everything and you get to share a cabin with some other people. You might have noticed some interesting personal habits of some of the other people in your cabin. And as I've been past a few of the rooms, kind of noxious fumes have been coming out. Imagine you're in this situation. You're in your cabin, you're getting ready to go swimming, people are getting changed, and right in the middle of just about when you've got your pants off, ready to get changed, the guy just down in the bed next to you, he manages to drop his guts in the most toxic way possible. And you know, if you want to ever smell the fresh, beautiful, clean outside air, you've got to get out awfully fast. But the difficulty is you're getting changed. And so, if you race out without your pants on, you'll die of embarrassment. If you stay inside, you'll die of asphyxiation. It's just one of those situations where you are hard-pressed on every side, and it seems like there is absolutely no way out. I remember when I started school, when I was in kindergarten as a little 5-year-old, some big bullies in grade 2 locked me in the toilets. And I was just a little 5-year-old. They were the big, tough 7-year-olds. And I could not get the door open. I was stuck in there. And my life flashed before my eyes. And I thought, man, am I going to spend the rest of my days on this planet inside the toilets at St. Mary's Immaculate School for Catholic kids in Manly? And I realised I didn't have the power to get him off. I had to wait for some teacher to come by and rescue me, because no matter what I did, I simply knew I couldn't get there. Because sometimes you end up in a situation and it feels like it's crushing you and you just simply can't break free. Sometimes it's serious stuff. See, maybe at home, maybe mum and dad are just not getting on that well and you'd love to bring them together. And you're really trying. In fact, you've set out to be the perfect kid just to make sure you're not the reason. And you're really trying to bring peace, but almost every time you open your mouth, you make it worse. And you suddenly realize whatever you do in that situation, it's almost like you're being crushed and it feels like there's no way to break free. And that's exactly the situation we've been looking at in our Bible studies. We started by looking at the great freedom that God has created us for. There's this beautiful freedom that we have to be in His image, ruling the world, enjoying Him forever. Yesterday we saw how we lose that freedom when we defy Him, and the result is guilt. And we carry that guilt around with us, and it crushes us. And often it just feels like there is simply no way that we can break out of it. Because when you ignore what is right, when you do what is wrong, when you defy what God says, when you break commandments you know God has put there, you know that you're doing the wrong thing. You know how that feels. You know how that guilt weighs in upon you and starts to affect almost everything that you do. You know what it's like when you give up your freedom. You know what it's like when you feel that pressure. You know what it's like when every part of who you are is simply weighed down by sin. Because that guilt tears away at your relationship with God. It tears away at the relationship you have with other people. It tears away at the relationship you have with yourself. And nobody can live like that. You can't keep going with that sort of pressure on you and still just have a HAPPY face on you. It gets to you. And for most of us, we will do anything to try and get rid of that guilt. Anything to shift the blame onto something else. Anything so we can be free from stuff that's binding us up and keeping it down. But here's the problem. Nothing works. You might get rid of a few feelings of guilt every now and again, but your actual guilt still remains. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in. Now, have you ever noticed that just when you think you're going to start doing well at something, there's always someone comes along to pull you down? Just when you think you've nailed something and you're getting better and you're improving, there's somebody there ready to criticize you, ready to tear you down, ready to squash you. Well, I got some bad news about living the Christian life. It's not just you feeling the weight of all this stuff. I want to identify for you there are 9 spiritual terrorists who are ganging up on you to actually keep dragging you down. 9 forces at work which will do everything within their power to keep you from being who God wants. Now, when we talk about a terrorist, you know what we're talking about. We're talking about a person who will use any means that they can to tear down anyone that they can. Right? A terrorist will use any means that they can to tear down anyone that they can. And they don't care if they get hurt in the process. And I want to suggest to you that in the Bible we find that there are 9 terrorists lining themselves up to try and tear you down. Now, here's some things about terrorists. They're sneaky. You actually don't know who they are. When those passengers got on board the American Airlines flights on September the 11th, 2001, they didn't know who the terrorists were. There were people sitting next to them on the plane that were going to cause their death, but they didn't know who they were. The Australians who were holidaying in Bali, and there were cars pulling up at the nightclub all the time, dropping people off, going away. Nobody knew which car had a terrorist in it. No one knew that there was going to be an explosion. People were caught unawares because that's how terrorism works. You don't even know who your enemies are sometimes. And as you go on in your Christian life, if you don't know who your enemies are, you'll find you get ambushed. As you go along in your Christian life, if you don't find out who these spiritual terrorists are and their tactics, you can get waylaid. And if you're not careful, if you can't identify who are the forces and the people that are opposed to you growing for Jesus, you will find that your freedom gets taken away from you. You'll discover you can't get to be where God wants you to be, and you'll discover that you feel crushed, blown away, torn apart, and you can end up feeling like a slave forever. Can I show you who these 9 terrorists are? Because I want you to be ready for them. I want you to understand their tactics, and with the power of Jesus, I want you to see some victory in your life. Let's look at the first of our 9 spiritual terrorists. This one has a name. It's called sin. Now, I'm going to look at a number of Bible references. You don't have to look them all up. I will put on the screen a little bit of each verse so you know where we are. You might like to jot them down so you can check them out later. But the first terrorist is sin. Here's what Jesus says, John 8:34. Jesus says, I tell you the truth, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now, does that make sense? Sin is a master who wants to control you. Now, here's the way it works. Every time you do a sin, it's a little bit easier next time to do the same sin. When I was a boy, my big sister concocted this plan as to how we could end up with a bag of minties when we didn't have the money to pay for it. And my sister concocted this plan, which I happily went along with, that we would lift one from the lovely people at Woolworths and take it outside the store. Now, I was about 8 years old. I was terrified. I was terrified that we were going to be caught. I was worried the police would be called. I was shaking like a leaf. This was my first criminal act. And my last criminal act. But when we actually got outside the store and nobody had stopped us, And we had it there for us to enjoy, all to be eaten before we got home so that Mum wouldn't find out. Do you realise the next time, if there was a next time, how much easier it would be? You see, every time you do a sin, it gets a little bit easier to do it again. And slowly, there are some things you're doing right now you don't even think about anymore. You are so used to doing them that sin has actually become your slave master. This spiritual terrorist is starting to control you. And Jesus says anyone who sins is a slave to sin. You know, if you could somehow deal with your guilt once and for all, sin would no longer have power over you. That's the first spiritual terrorist. Number 2 is the law. Now, I don't know if you've thought about this. Human beings have inbuilt into us that we need laws. Now, you might think that's funny because you're thinking, I don't want no laws. I don't want no rules. I don't want anyone telling me what to do. Seriously, we are designed, we need laws. Now, you might resent them, you might hate them, you might break them, but we desperately need them. We need laws so much that even when there are no laws, we'll make them up. Little kids walking along a footpath, happy and carefree, and somebody says, you're not allowed to step on the cracks. And you get punched if you step on the cracks. And suddenly there's a law, and these poor little kiddies feel they have to obey it. Who made up that law? Who suggested that kids couldn't walk on cracks? But when there is no law, we make it up. We're over at boys' camp last night, and there's some wild things happening. I noticed some guys throwing a football around in a circle, and I thought, that looks like a good game. I thought maybe I could join in, and then I noticed what happened, and I thought, no. Because they could have just thrown it, and they could have actually thrown it cooperatively to say, I will do a really easy pass so that my friend can catch it easily. That would have been a good idea, I would think. No, that's not what I did. They were firing it like bullets. But they had made up some laws. I don't quite understand them, but you had to clap before you caught it. You know, one of those things. I didn't quite get it, but apparently if you don't clap and then catch it, you had to do something. Now, I couldn't quite work out the priority of this, but people were doing lots of push-ups, and then people started to take clothes off. It was getting quite ugly, folks. It could have just been a nice little game of throwing the ball around, but they'd made up these laws, these rules, which had to be followed, and people were punished if they didn't follow it. I've discovered there are laws which cover passing wind. There are farting laws. Now, who made these up? Now, apparently it goes something like this. If you were to pass wind in the company of other people, you need to say the word safe. And you've got to get in there awfully fast. Because if you don't get in awfully fast, you know what happens? Somebody else says, 6 fishes. You then have to think of 6 different kinds of fish. You know, barramundi, flounder, trout, dory. Yeah, all those. Here's the problem. They can relentlessly punch you until you have your 6th fish out. When did a bodily function turn into a set of laws? Does that make sense? We want laws so much that even when there are none, we make them up because we are designed to live by laws. Now, laws are actually a good idea because they keep us safe and they guide us for life. If you've been driving out on the freeway, those lane lines are like laws, and they're kind of a good idea because they keep the cars roughly in the correct lane and it minimises accidents. When I was in LA recently, and I was just getting used to the freeways being 5 lanes wide on each side, suddenly my 5-lane freeway was 10 lanes wide and another freeway had joined it. And I was awfully glad that there were lane lines there because that actually kept me safe. Laws are like lane lines. They show us the way forward. They keep us safe. And that's why we need them. And God's laws are good things. God gives his law in his word. They are guidelines for living. They show us the path to go on. They show us how to be safe. They show us how to get to the destination. Here's the problem, though. God's laws don't give us the power to obey them. And even though they're good laws and they're given us by God for our benefit, when we don't obey them, we stand accused by those laws. We stand condemned by those laws. And we actually think, if I can just obey God, then I will be right. If somehow I could just get all these laws right, I'd be okay with God. Now, have you ever tried that? Have you ever reached a point in your life where you've decided you're going to be good? You decide, well, I'm just not going to sin again. Or maybe there's just one particular sin, and you're thinking, I am never, ever, ever going to do that sin again. And 24 hours later, you find that you're still committing it. That's the problem with laws. Nothing wrong with the laws. The laws are a good gift from God, but when we refuse to obey them, they stand there and condemn us and enslave us. Let me read to you from Romans chapter 7, verse 5. It simply says that our sinful passions, aroused by the law, were at work in our bodies, so that we bore fruit for death. But now, by dying to what once bound us. See, the Bible says we're actually bound up by God's laws. We're held captive by them. Every time you break one of God's laws, you are actually condemned by that law. That's another spiritual terrorist. That leads us to the third spiritual terrorist, condemnation. Romans 1:18, it simply says, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Now, have you ever thought about this? People of all generations, in all cultures, all fear having an angry God. Have you ever noticed, no matter what the culture, whatever the society, ancient or modern, whatever religion they dream up, there's always a ritual to try and stop the gods being angry. And some of those rituals are pretty horrendous. Children have been sacrificed to try and please an angry God. People have been tortured and killed because people are trying to stop God being angry with him. And that's just universal across all generations. Because here's the issue. When you feel guilty, you don't want to face up with God. And when you feel guilty, you don't want to face up with him either. Does it make sense that if somehow all your guilt could be taken away, you would have no problems whatsoever in facing up to God? That's the third spiritual terrorist, condemnation. Here's the fourth one. It's Satan. 1 Peter 5:8, be self-controlled and alert. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. And Satan is there reminding you of your failures. You call yourself a Christian and look what you just did to that person. You're a failure. Give up. God's probably given up on you anyway. And Satan is there to drag us down at every opportunity. But does it make sense? If your guilt could be dealt with once and for all, Satan would have no more power over you. Satan's the fourth spiritual terrorist. Number 5 is the demonic powers, the demons. Because, we get this idea that somehow Satan is operating like Rambo. He's just, all by himself. He's got no help and he just goes about all on his little lonesome. Hey, when you read the Bible, he has a whole army at his disposal. A whole army of demons who are there at his beck and call to wreak whatever havoc that he would like. This is from Ephesians 6:12. It simply says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, just against human beings, but it's against the rulers. It's against the authorities. It's against the powers of this dark world. It's against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Now, did you just catch the terms that the Bible uses to tell you who is opposing you? Words like the rulers, they're talking about the demons here, the authorities, the powers of the dark world, the spiritual forces of evil. But does it make sense? If all your guilt could suddenly be dealt with, if all your guilt could be taken away, then the demons would have no power over you whatsoever. Okay, spiritual terrorist number 6 is your own desires. Now, this is a tricky one. In the Middle Ages, Christians started to think, you know, if we could isolate ourselves from all those bad, sinful people out there, we wouldn't have any sin in our community. So they built these big monasteries and they put big walls around them, and you become a monk or an abbot or a sister or something. And then you would live a life dedicated to God behind these huge walls, which would keep all the bad stuff out. They would keep the sin out. You could have a life that was free from sin. Do you know the problem with that one? It's your own desires that you take with you that will drag you down. Let me tell you what Jesus says. Mark chapter 7, verse 21. He says, from within, out of men's hearts come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and foolishness. All these evils come from inside and make a man unclean. You know what the problem with the monasteries was? Every one of those monks who went in God's service took with them a spiritual terrorist. It was themselves. And you can lock Christians away in a nice little tidy setup. We can lock Christians away in a monastery. We can lock you away in a lovely Christian youth group. We can lock you away in a Christian school. But you see, just as much sin will get in there as anywhere else. Sin is not like sickness. You don't catch it from other people. Sin is like death. It is inbuilt into your own body. If you isolated yourself now for the rest of your life and never communicated with anybody ever again, there would be as much sin in your life as if you mixed with everybody around the world, because your own desires, your own wrong desires, are a spiritual terrorist who will drag you down. Now, does it make sense? If all your guilt could be taken away, then your own desires would have no more power to control you. That's spiritual terrorist number 6. Number 7 is your conscience. Hebrews 10:22 talks about a guilty conscience. And every one of you's got a conscience which gives you an idea of what is right and what is wrong. And it's a wonderful guide. Here's the problem. When you go against the standards of your own conscience, your conscience condemns you. When you know what's right and you know what's wrong, but you choose not to do the right thing, your own conscience is there to condemn you and to criticize you and tear you down as another spiritual terrorist. So sometimes we think, I know, I'll just lower my standards. I can't meet the standards of my conscience, and so you actually lower the standards in your conscience. Now, you can lower them as low as you like. Here's the problem. No matter how low you make your standards, you will still fail to keep up to them, and your conscience will still condemn you and drag you down and enslave you. If somehow every bit of your guilt could be taken away, then your conscience would have no more power to enslave you. And just in case you were thinking that maybe it's going to get better, can I bring you the next spiritual terrorist? It's the whole world. This is what Jesus says: the whole world is under the control of the evil one. Do you sometimes find it hard to be a Christian? You sometimes find like it's almost like the world's stacked against you? Well, here's the truth. It is. We live in a world where sin has pervaded every part of our world, and it's almost like everything and everyone in the world will work against you becoming the person that God wants. That's why doing nothing about your Christian life will take you backwards. Because the world is so permeated by sin, the world is like a sort of backwards moving escalator. It's taking you down. And if you just stand still, guess what? You're going down. That's the world that we live in, and Jesus warns us that the whole of the world will gang up to condemn us. If you're finding it a bit of a struggle being a Christian, I understand that, because so many forces are ganging up against you. Now, if every bit of your guilt could be dealt with once and for all, then you had nothing to fear from the world trying to enslave you. Let me give you the final one. It's death. Death itself. Hebrews 2:15 talks about those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Come on, at some stage, everybody's scared of death. And you know, we live in a world where we do all these crazy things to try and prevent it. Things to make us live longer, make us healthier. Look, if you're going to market a product that's going to promise people they'll live longer and feel better, man, people will flock to buy it, because we're all trying to cheat death. But guess what? Even with our modern medicine and our high-tech hospitals, we suck at cheating death. The mortality rate in Australia at the moment is 100%. That is, everybody dies. Now, here's the fear. You know that when you die, you'll discover what's on the other side. And if, as everybody has taught you, there's a God and you've got to account to him, you know that death means you've got to stand before God to give an account of your life. Now, does it make sense? If every bit of your guilt could be taken away, you would never have fear of death. You would never have a fear of standing up before God. Now, right now, I know what's going through your minds. You're thinking to yourself, but hang on, doesn't God forgive sin? I'm sure I heard that somewhere. There was a week at Crossfire where I think somebody mentioned that. There must have been a Sunday school about that once. Surely I have learnt from my childhood that God forgives sins. I mean, that's his job. Isn't it? Isn't it sort of like part of his job description? That God is nice and loving and kind and understanding, and he'll never get anyone into trouble. He's like the old elderly grandfather who doesn't have the energy left to discipline the grandchildren and lets them do all the things that mum and dad say they can't. And that God's just a really nice softy, and he just forgives everyone. You know, it's not part of his job description. You know how sometimes a person's job description tells you what they must do. If someone works at McDonald's, we've got any McDonald's workers here? Oh, we love our McDonald's workers. Love you. You know, part of the job description is, would you like some fries with that? It just goes with the deal. We got any Kmart workers here? Oh, I think Woolies is ruling. If you're a Kmart person, it's part of the job description. Do you have flybys? It just goes with the job description. And we think that with God, part of his job description is he automatically forgives sins. Here's the deal. You commit the sin, that's your job description. God forgives you. That's his job description. Guys, you could not be further from the truth. God does not automatically forgive sins. I want to show you some things that are said in the Bible which tell us for certain that God doesn't just automatically forgive sins. Exodus 34 verse 6 simply finishes with these words, he does not leave the guilty unpunished. If people are guilty before him, his punishment must come. Lamentations 3:40 finishes with these words, we have sinned and rebelled, and they're talking to God, and you have not forgiven. Jeremiah 5 verse 7, it's the words of God. He is talking to his people, and he simply says, why should I forgive you? And finishes by saying, should I not punish them? 2 Kings 24 verse 3 simply records the Lord was not willing to forgive. If you've grown up thinking that God automatically forgives every single sin, you could not be further from the truth. That is not what God is like. And I'll show you why. Because I want to show you what God does think about our sin. There is one verse in the Bible which makes it clear for us. From a prophet you may not look up very often. He's got a funny sounding name, Habakkuk. This is chapter 1, verse 13. This is a description of God. Just listen to it. It says to God, "Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrong." Now, did you get the two halves of that? He says to God, your eyes are too holy to look at evil. Do you know what it means for God to be holy? It means he is totally separate from anything which is sinful. God being holy means nothing with any sin on it can ever exist in his presence. Otherwise, you'd be consumed by the fire of his holiness. That is, God's holiness shines and burns fiercely like the light of the sun burns fiercely. Let's imagine that we're going to be rather adventurous and we're going to go on a space expedition. And we're not content with going to the moon or any of those sorts of things. We're going to have a space expedition to the sun. And we're going to land on the sun and claim it for Australia. Now let's just think about the logistics of this. And you can't cheat by saying, we'll go at night when it's not so hot. No, that doesn't work. Let's imagine we had the best scientists in the world designing the best flame retardant materials. Does it make sense to you? No matter how clever we are, we ain't going to get nowhere near that sun. As soon as you even get close to it, you will be consumed by the fire which burns passionately and constantly from it. Does that make sense? Because the sun is a ball of flaming fire, you can't even get close, and anything which tries to approach will be consumed by it. God burns in the same way with holiness. He is separate from evil. I'll tell you what that means. If anyone with any sin on them tries to approach him, they will be consumed by his holiness. If anyone with any evil in them tries to live with God, they will be consumed by his holiness before they even get there. If anyone tries to be with God with one speck of guilt on them, they will be consumed by his holiness which burns so brightly. God cannot just forgive sins. He cannot sweep it under the carpet and pretend that everything is fine. His holiness demands that sin must be punished. Just before we finish, I want to show you something fantastic. In the middle of this sea, which looks like it's a sea of despair, knowing our guilt, our failings, those terrorists that are ganging up to drag us down, God saying that he won't just automatically forgive sins. I want to show you something absolutely marvelous. I could have picked this from a number of places. Let me give you two verses. Ezekiel 36, verse 25, includes these words where God says to his people, "I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols." Somewhere in the middle of God's holiness demanding that our sin be punished, he gives us a glimmer of hope. That he will do something one day where we can be cleansed. The prophet Zechariah puts it this way. Zechariah 13, verse 1. He says, on that day, a fountain will be opened to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and impurity. Whatever it is that God is going to do, it's described like a fountain which will clean anyone who flocks to it, that their sin can be wiped away, that their impurities can be cleansed, that they can be made whole and clean and free exactly the way that God had created them to be. You know, I think some of us have got to rethink things. Some of us just cruise along thinking, my sin doesn't matter. God will just forgive it. And we do not understand how wonderful and majestic and powerful and holy our God is. Because God's holiness will destroy anyone who tries to live with him who has one speck of sin on them. One speck of guilt. You simply cannot survive. The only way you could survive before God is if somehow every bit of guilt was taken away before you approached him. Tomorrow morning is going to be a very special day in our community. We're having a study which we're calling the Day of Freedom. Because tomorrow we want to see what God has done which changes everything. We want to find out what God has done so that you can be cleansed. We want to find out how we restore what we have lost, how we become the people that God has designed to live in that freedom and to enjoy him and to live for him and to win victories for him and to be used to change this world. But maybe some of us have got to do a rethink. Coasting on auto control. Not worrying, thinking I'm not going backwards, but we're standing on that escalator going down. Tomorrow morning is going to be an opportunity. If you know you've never said yes to Jesus, I want to explain as clearly as I can from the Bible what Jesus has done to defeat every one of the 9 terrorists so that you can have a life which starts and goes for eternity. If you've been on our camps before, you'll know that sometimes we offer this invitation right at the end of camp. But we want to do it tomorrow morning. And I believe there's a whole stack of people for whom tomorrow will be their day of decision. It will be their day of freedom. Guys, we have a God who wants you to be free. He wants to empower you. He wants you to achieve the dizzy heights of being the person that he has made. Tomorrow morning, we're looking at the day of freedom. And it might just be for you that tomorrow will be your day of freedom. Thank you very much.